Last night at our liturgy, Archbishop Laurie reflected on the first reading, which was the story of the Tower of Babel, where all the languages were mixed up. Some of you may be experiencing that today as you hear a lot of different things going on. And we just want to apologize that the interpretation devices from English to Spanish, they got lost somewhere. So we're praying to St. Anthony, but I don't think they're going to come that fast. So just so you know, that's what's happening. But of course, we all speak the same language of love. And we invite Joan to present to us as we continue to reach out in love to all people.
Good afternoon. Whenever I hear the gospel reading that we heard about today in our prayer and reflection service, that story of the Last Judgment, when we learn how our lives will be judged in the end, I think of an experience I had at the University of Dayton. Catholic Relief Services was entering into a partnership with the University of Dayton, and the president of the university was explaining why the University of Dayton would want to work with Catholic Relief Services. And he said, if you think about that story of the Last Judgment, when Jesus tells us that in the end our lives will be judged by those by how we care for those in greatest need, he said, to use language our students understand, we all know what's going to be on the final exam. The question is, are we preparing our students to pass? And I think that's a question that we all have to ask ourselves, right? Are we prepared to pass that final exam? And are we in our work in the church, for those of us who are in ministry roles, are we helping our people to pass? Because Christ never says, when he talks about that story of the Last Judgment, he never says, but really, the only people who have to care about this are the 10 people on the Social Concerns Committee. And everybody else can just forget about caring for the poor, the hungry, those in need of clothing and things. And he never says, well, you know, you really only have to worry about that gospel passage when you've turned 65 and retired and you have plenty of time. That message is a message for each and every believer at every stage in our lives. And we need to think about how we can bring that to life in our lives and bring it to life in our parishes and our schools. It's something that we think about all the time at Catholic Relief Services. Now, you probably are aware of how Catholic Relief Services, as the agency that was established by the bishops of the United States nearly 75 years ago to represent all of us, the Catholic community in the U.S., responding to people in need around the world. When you think of CRS, you probably think of our role around the world, and we now work in 100 countries and serve 100 million people. But what you may not know is that the bishops have also asked us to help here in the United States. We don't do what Catholic Charities does. We don't respond to poverty here in the U.S., but we do work with parishes and schools and dioceses to help all of us bring to life in our lives, in the lives of our parishes and our institutions, that response to the gospel call to care for the least among us. And that's why this opportunity to be with you today is so important to us at Catholic Relief Services, because we want to share together reflections on how we can both understand, deepen our understanding of Catholic social teaching, of that wonderful tradition we have that informs how we approach going out to the peripheries and responding to people in need. And we also want to share and reflect on what we actually do to do that and how we can all be involved. So we ask ourselves all the time, how can we help grow the excitement among Catholics about bringing God's love into the world, especially among people who need it most? We ask ourselves, how can we help Catholics feel proud of our church? How locally and around the world, as part of a universal church, we perform amazing acts of kindness and charity and mercy every day, here in the U.S. and around the world. How can we help young people, especially? How can we tap into their interest in helping to build a better world and help them to understand that they can do that through and with their church, through and with their community of faith as they develop into the next generation of leaders for our church. So our first task is to help our people become more aware of the rich resource we have in our social tradition, in Scripture, and in Catholic social teaching. So if I could have the PowerPoint, please. Okay, we are a little... Is there a chance we could start at the beginning? Get it back to the beginning? Oh, there. Okay, good. Okay. So one of the messages of Scripture that I think we really need to reflect on and also help people, our family members and our parishioners and the students in our schools and our religious ed programs, help all of us reflect on is not just the story of the Last Judgment, which is so powerful in its message about going to the peripheries as an essential part of our faith, but also that story of the greatest commandment. How powerful is it that when Christ was asked, what is the most important commandment, he couldn't offer just one. Because we can't understand loving God, which is the start of this passage, without understanding that it inevitably calls us to love our neighbors and to reach out to our neighbors. Whenever I think of that, whenever I think of that story of the greatest commandment when we're called to inevitably reach out to our brothers and sisters, I think of a colleague of mine named Peter Kameo. He's a Kenyan. He was on our staff at CRS. He retired recently, but he told of when he was a little boy in his village in Kenya, they were suffering through a drought, and there was no food, and there was no water to grow the food, and no one had food. And his mother one day realized that Peter's mother and father were not going to eat that day. They had no food. But she was hoping that little Peter, who was 5 years old, could just get a little food if he went next door to the neighbor. And he went to the neighbor with his little empty bowl, and he came back with an empty bowl. And he said, "Mom, the neighbors have no food either." And one of the things that really struck me was he told about how his mother put salt on his finger because when a child begins to starve, they have a terrible taste in their mouths. And so she knew that the little bit of salt that she had would help him sleep when he was going through that experience of his body beginning to starve. And I thought to myself when I heard him tell that story that how heartbreaking it is that there are mothers in the world that need to know what to do when their baby is starving. And it also struck me that there are places in the world then and now where the neighbors nearby can't step up and love their neighbors. They're in need of help too. And who is it that's going to step up and help, if not us? So what a compelling reminder that our neighbors are next door and our neighbors are around the world, and people need our help here and around the world. I also want to lift up the story of Lazarus and the rich man, which is another very profound reminder of what happens when we ignore the poor in our midst. So, of course, the rich man ignored Lazarus at his door. After they both died, Lazarus went to be with Abraham in paradise in heaven, and the rich man was living in torment in hell. And what strikes me about that is I always think of an experience that I had with one of our CRS parish ambassadors. There are a couple here in the room, in fact, that people who are leaders in their parishes working with CRS to bring to life our commitment to our brothers and sisters around the world. But one of our parish ambassadors was explaining why she became a CRS parish ambassador. And she said, you know, when I watched on TV, did we lose the PowerPoint? There we go. When I watched on TV and I saw the little boy Amran sitting in that ambulance outside of Aleppo in Syria, she said, the first thing I thought is that he is our Lazarus. And she said to herself, I can't respond like the rich man. And so she got involved in helping her parish to more actively reach out to our brothers and sisters who are suffering nearby and around the world. Now, I think we also want to reflect for ourselves and help our families and our parishioners, the people we work with, to remember that we have a rich body of teaching. And I just want to lift up some papal teaching that calls us to care for those in greatest need, to go to the peripheries. This is a quote from a recent papal teaching. I hope it's the right one. I can't quite see, but it says, "We cannot delude ourselves. By our mutual love, and in particular by our concern for those in need, we will be recognized as true followers of Christ. This will be the criterion by which the authenticity of our Eucharistic celebrations is judged." Now, that's a very powerful statement. This will be the criterion by which the authenticity of our Eucharistic celebrations will be judged. It doesn't say this is one of many criteria. It says this will be the criterion. Now, who do you think said that? Pope John Paul II. Here is another example. "Love for widows and orphans, prisoners, and the sick and needy of every kind is as essential to the Church as the ministry of the sacraments and the preaching of the gospel. The Church cannot neglect the service of charity any more than she can neglect the sacraments and the word." So again, a very powerful message that we all know that the sacraments are central to our lives as Catholic Christians. We all know that preaching the gospel and understanding the gospel and sharing the gospel is essential to our lives as Catholic Christians. Do we all understand that caring for those in need is as essential? And when we talk about this mission of the church, that is essential to the church, who is the church? Who is the church? We all are. This is what our lives as individuals, this is what our parishes, this is what our schools, what all of our both individuals and institutions as a Catholic community need to reflect. Now, who do you think said that? Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. So, who have I not quoted? Pope Francis. Now, you would think that in a presentation on going to the peripheries, he would be the first person I would quote, but I don't. And there's a reason for that. Because some people think that this caring for the poor and being merciful is kind of something Pope Francis discovered recently. It's like his charism, right? I actually heard a seminarian say, shortly after Pope Francis was elected and he began to talk about the simple life that he was calling us all to live and caring for the poor and reaching out to people and stuff, the seminarian said, well, you know, he's pretty old. If we just wait him out, we'll get back to normal. Well, the reason I don't always start by quoting Pope Francis is because we all have to understand caring for the poor, going to the peripheries is normal. That's what all of our papal teaching says. That's what the gospel says. It's what all of our tradition. And certainly Pope Francis has helped us remember how integral, how holistic our teaching on this is. Here's one example when he says, "When we fail to acknowledge as part of reality the worth of a person, of a poor person, a human embryo, a person with disabilities, to offer just a few examples, it becomes difficult to hear the cry of nature itself. Everything is connected." This idea that reaching out to the peripheries, caring for God's children and God's creation is at the heart of who we are, is at the heart of Francis's message, and it's at the heart of the message that we need to live and we need to share with our families and our parishes and our schools. And we have a great resource to draw on to help us bring this into our lives, to help us make decisions in our lives in light of our faith, and that resource is Catholic social teaching. So a key challenge for all of us is to make sure that we are aware of Catholic social teaching and that we are sharing it in our families and our parishes and our schools. Do our people know Catholic social teaching? And do they use it? And do we use it to shape our decisions in our lives? How many of you have heard of the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching? Okay, quite a few, but maybe not everybody. The bishops of the United States identify these key themes of Catholic social teaching because they realize that although we have wonderful documents most of which have Latin titles like Rerum Novarum and Centesimus Annus and things, that if you have to go to your confirmation class and tell them about these papal documents that, you know, are who knows how many pages long and have a Latin title, and you had to say to your confirmation class, how about reading all this stuff? Not going to happen, right? Their eyes are going to glaze over. So this is the Cliff Notes version, the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. And what I want to do is just take a few more minutes to reflect on how we live out these themes, because understanding them doesn't just involve understanding the ideas. These are not just abstract ideas for us. We live them every day, and I want to lift that up. So let's start with the dignity of the human person. How rich is our teaching that the sacredness of life at every stage and in every condition is at the forefront of who we are and what we believe. This is an example of how we live it out. This is Juan. Juan hit his head on a corner, on an edge, and although he initially seemed to heal, about a month later he noticed swelling and pain. He ignored it because he was uninsured, and he didn't think he could get any help. Eventually it got so bad that he went to a free clinic, and they told him that he had a very serious condition that required surgery. He had no money for surgery. Who do you think he turned to? He turned to our church. And Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Washington, just as one example, brought him to their healthcare network, which connects low-income people to medical specialists who provide pro bono care. Juan had his surgery. It would have cost $50,000, but now his health and his life are renewed. And we help thousands of people like Juan every day through our Catholic Charities agencies. Isn't that a wonderful story to tell? And shouldn't we be helping all our people feel proud of that? But we don't just do it in the United States. Well, maybe we do. Oh. There we go. Oh. Sorry, this isn't working too well. Can you go 2 slides ahead? There we go. Okay, a colleague of mine recently got back from Guinea. So Guinea is one of the countries in West Africa where Catholic Relief Services works. And we are working there with the local church to address the crisis of malaria. We often hear from bishops around the world, please help us, our babies are dying. Malaria in a particular way affects children under 5, and some studies suggest that 1 child dies every minute from malaria and its effects. So think for yourself, since we've been in this room, how many children have died from malaria. But our church is there to help, and during the time that my colleagues were there, and you can see the line lining up there, we helped the church in Guinea over an 8-day period at 1,100 distribution sites to distribute 4.6 million mosquito nets. Our church is around the world saving lives every day. We need to know that story, and we need to share that story and celebrate it as we understand our commitment to the dignity of the human person. Okay, move forward, please. Okay. Yes. So the theme of solidarity is another one of the key themes of Catholic social teaching, and it basically reminds us that we are our brothers and sisters' keepers, that we are called to promote the common good, not just to look out for ourselves, but to strengthen the bonds and heal the divisions among people. And one of the most striking examples of how we do this work is the work that Catholic Charities agencies do to reach out to support ex-offenders and reintegrate former gang members. And a great example occurs right here in Baltimore, where Catholic Charities has been working with former gang members who are now working with young people to help them avoid the lure of the gang. And I've met some of these men who are a part of this program, and they are so impressive because of the difference they are making in very challenging and even dangerous situations in some of the most challenging neighborhoods in Baltimore. But again, next slide, we don't just do this in the United States. So One of the places where our church is responding very much is to the refugee crisis in Syria, the refugees that have come into Lebanon, into Jordan, into Turkey, and to various places. One of the biggest tragedies of that situation is that impact on children. More than half, there are 9 million people who have been displaced because of the war in Syria. More than half of them are children. I read a study that suggested that of those children, 60% are suffering from full-blown depression, and 40% are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. How are these children going to lead their country in that region in the future with that kind of trauma that they've experienced? So we at Catholic Relief Services with the local church have been especially focusing on the children and creating child-friendly spaces where they can get back to normal. If I can get the, oh yeah, it's not going to stay though. Okay, these are the pictures when they come in that they draw. How tragic that they're not drawing pictures of the sun and rainbows and things that little children should be drawing. But we do try to get them back into a situation where they're playing. And one little girl came to one of our centers like this. She was a Muslim girl. Many of the Syrian refugees are Muslim. And of course, we help people not because they're Catholic, but because we're Catholic, and we're called to help anyone in need. And so this little girl came in and she said to one of my colleagues, you know, I came to this refugee camp and all the kids said, go to the tent that says Catholic Relief Services. She said, I never had heard the word Catholic before, but I walked in and I saw all the kids playing and the wonderful situation for the kids, and I just assumed the word Catholic meant help. Isn't it wonderful? And can't we all be proud that we're known as the people that help all over the world? Okay, one more preferential option for the poor. This is Lavanda, and Lavanda struggled for years with drug addiction, and she lost everything. She lost her home, she lost her job, she even lost, at one point, custody of her children. But she decided that she wanted to turn her life around, and guess who she came to? She came to our church and to Catholic Charities, and through a series of support systems, counseling, all kinds of things, Lavanda was able to turn her life around. She's got a job, she's got her own home, her two daughters are with her, and she has been sober for 10 years. Those are the kinds of lives that we change every day. But again, we don't just do that here in the United States, we do it around the world. This is Ethiopia. This is what the terrain looks like in much of Ethiopia. Imagine how hard it is to grow food and support your family when that's what the land looks like. But our church is there helping people. So we help them terrace the hillside so when it rains, the water goes into the ground, it doesn't wash away. As a result, maybe. Okay, can we have the next slide? No. Yeah. As a result, streams that were dry for decades, you see it on the left, are renewed. There's water, and we can pipe that water into the village, and as a result, the landscape goes from this to this. Isn't that amazing? Imagine what it's like for those families. They can feed their families year-round. They have water in their village. They can use these keyhole gardens that when they need to conserve water, and they can still grow food year-round. Okay, yeah. I just want to introduce you to Haya, the little girl who's looking at us. Haya was 12 years old when I was there. She spent every day of her life spending 8 hours going to get water and bringing it back for her family. That's all she did, and that's all she ever would do. If our church wasn't there in that village helping them to develop that water system. And now she's going to school. Her life will be dramatically different because she will be able to add. That means she can have a little business. She can buy a goat and sell it and keep track of the money and everything. So what can we do? I just want to give you a couple of suggestions. There are 4 things that we suggest that we can all do, and I hope you will invite others in your family and in your parishes and stuff to do that. The first one, we call it PLAG. First one is pray. That is always the foundation. That is always the starting point. Nothing can be done without prayer and without God's help. Learn. We have lots of resources where we can learn about the needs of our brothers and sisters and what we are doing as a church and help our people to be proud and to participate in what we're doing as a church to respond. Act, and there are many ways that we can act through advocacy and through purchasing fair trade products and all kinds of things, and then give, of course, as a part of what we can do, share what we have to the extent that we can. So I'm just going to share with you a couple of suggested websites. So always go to your Catholic Charities website if you want to learn how you can participate in these examples. Another great resource is, it's called We Are Salt and Light through the USCCB. They have wonderful resources for prayer and learning that you can use in your families, in your parishes, etc. And then finally, crs.org. We've got lots of fun activities and prayer resources and learning resources. Help tell the story of the wonderful work the church is doing, and you can find that on these websites. So I just want to say that, sometimes I know that we can look at how much need there is at the peripheries and feel a little overwhelmed. And we can say to ourselves, how can we make a dent in this? What difference can we make? And I want to suggest, if you go to the next slide, that we should never underestimate the impact we can have. This is the village in Ethiopia that I showed you that got the water project. And these women were there singing and dancing and celebrating. And one of my colleagues said to them, what difference did it make that you have this water project in your village now? And the first answer we got was, none of my children died this year. We make a huge difference in the lives of people on the periphery all the time. It is a part of our mission as Catholics, and we can all participate. So I invite you to continue our time together this morning as we move into prayer, reflecting on how we can save and transform lives, and in the process, prepare ourselves and the people we work with to pass that ultimate final exam.